Alright, it is Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis Eve, and we got a really cool Famitsu article that just recently dropped that goes a little bit more in depth with Ever Crisis, and funny enough, how it's going to add to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and even Remake. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, or if you like what you hear, feel free to click the like button, and let's smash the subscribe button with a spell today. Let's do a Bolt 3. Show that sub button who's boss if you want to stay up to date with my channel. So this interview comes to us from Famitsu and was thankfully translated by Audrey on Twitter, and in it they sat down with Nomura, Toriyama, and Ichikawa to talk a little bit more about Ever Crisis, some of the changes they've made, and what we can look forward to, and oddly enough, how it's going to impact Rebirth and Remake and beyond. So starting off first, this one is super important, and that is the story arcs will be updated one chapter at a time each month. At launch, the stories that will be available are the OG Final Fantasy VII arc, Crisis Core, and First Soldier. And jumping ahead in the interview, they go a little bit more in depth with the actual structure and how they're releasing these things, which I think clarifies so much and alleviates a lot of fears that people had. So Toriyama does confirm that at launch, Ever Crisis will have three main stories: OG FF7, Crisis Core, and the First Soldier. For FF7, you'll be playing through the entirety of the Midgar section. They then plan to release new story chunks among those three stories at around one chapter update a month. What they release in Ever Crisis specifically regarding the Final Fantasy VII story parts will complement the Rebirth stuff that we'll be seeing at that time of release. So that I think is super important. So I'm really happy that they cleared that up because it alleviates so many concerns that people had. And first off, I feel really stupid because if I'm not mistaken, they told us this already, right? When Ever Crisis was first revealed, I'm pretty sure that they said they would be releasing content in episodic format. So apparently we all knew that and we just forgot it. But it alleviates so many concerns and fears that people had of, oh no, we're going to see the remake versions of Cid, Vincent, and Cait Sith before we even see what they look like in Rebirth. And based on this info, that's not going to be the case. By the time we get to them in Ever Crisis, we're going to be balls deep in like trailer 5 of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. We will have already seen them, so it's not going to be a really big concern, thankfully. The First Soldier story will eventually explore the reason why Sephiroth's Masamune does not appear in the trailer. And this to me just kind of made common sense. I didn't expect Sephiroth to be using the Masamune since he, first joined Soldier. That was most likely a weapon that he worked up to. And based on how they're treating it in First Soldier, it's not just going to be a sword he obtains, it's going to have a backstory. And there's going to be weight to why he obtains that sword and why he begins to use it. They also mentioned that the town we see in the most recent trailer, as well as what's going to be in the First Soldier campaign, is a town called, stick with me here, Radioli, depending on your level of literacy, and it's a town that is located between Wutai and Mideel, but it's much closer to Wutai, and it's also a town that happens to hate Shinra, so it's going to be interesting to see the conflict that Sephiroth has there of going to this town, maybe trying to help and save the people who might not want it from him. And it's also intriguing too because the First Soldier stuff actually looks pretty interesting, and from what I've heard from the beta reactions, the characters of Glenn, Matt, and Lucia and their First Soldier campaign are actually pretty well received so far. So I wouldn't be shocked if this town or maybe even some of the characters end up in the Remake trilogy in Rebirth or in Part 3, assuming Shinra doesn't destroy the town after they're done with it. The next one, character stories shown in FF7 Ever Crisis allow audiences to understand the characters' feelings even more so than when they played Remake or Rebirth. They plan to include how Tifa met Avalanche, which was in the light novel Traces of Two Pasts. By including this episode, it will change the weight of what Tifa was going through when she cried after they lost Avalanche. And moving a little bit forward into that interview, Ever Crisis producer Ichikawa says that the scope of 7 Rebirth is greater than that of 7 Remake. And with Ever Crisis, they plan to use various information in the mobile game to complement the story for Rebirth. So those three things together might sound complicated and it might sound like a Kingdom Hearts situation, which thankfully I don't think it is. So with Kingdom Hearts, Hearts. They had Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, and then they decided to release about 600 spin-off games that were all important to the main overall plot and story progression of the Kingdom Hearts franchise, which is a really horrible way to structure your story because there's going to be so many people out there, including myself, who only play the first 2 Kingdom Hearts. We don't touch the spin-offs, and then by the time we got to Kingdom Hearts 3, I myself was super confused. I didn't know half the characters, I didn't know what the story was going forward, and there was a pretty big moment towards the end of that game where this character shows up to help Sora, to save him in battle, and they're building it up to this big grandiose moment, and I'm like, oh my god, is it someone from the original Kingdom Hearts? Is it going to be a Final Fantasy character? They reveal the character and he turns around to face Sora, and I'm thinking to myself, I don't know who you are, sir. Do you even go here? Structuring your story like that is a pretty horrible way to do things, and based on what they're saying here, that's not what's going on. It's all going to be supplemental material that adds impact and weight to the stuff we're already seeing in Remake and Rebirth. So you can play Remake and you can play Rebirth and you can feel the story, the impact of what the characters are going through, and if you want extra on top of that, there's the supplemental stuff from Ever Crisis that pulls from things like Traces of Two Pasts. But you won't need it to understand why characters feel the way they do. In 7 Remake, when Tifa breaks down after losing Avalanche in 7th Heaven, you don't need supplemental material to tell you why. They do such a good enough job already with the writing and with Tifa's performance that you understand what she's going through from the beginning of the game. Everything's very clear and laid out in the writing in those games, and it's fantastic. So it doesn't sound like you're going to be missing out on super important details, just some extra stuff that's there if you want it. So if you really want to think about it like this, it's almost kind of like the active time lore in Final Fantasy 16, except we're going to be playing through the mobile game Ever Crisis, and that's going to just be in real time, adding to what we're experiencing in Rebirth, which is actually kind of cool. And they can also time this stuff, so by the time Rebirth comes out, and a way to celebrate could be like, hey, let's do Rocket Town and Ever Crisis to help build up the Rocket Town section in Rebirth. So it sounds like they've really thought this through, and it's going to be something that hopefully works. And Toriyama also says that the OG Final Fantasy story events will follow the original, but small details might change to reflect the current generation, such as various lines or portrayals, so that fans new and old can enjoy. Which to me just sounds like what they did with Final Fantasy VII Remake. They changed certain things here and there to help with the localization. The localization in 7 Remake was fantastic, the writing was great, the dialogue, all of that. And my mind also thinks of the Honeybee Inn section, where in the original game, that didn't age very well. It was very much played for laughs, and you had certain stereotypes that were in that section of the game, but you look at how they did it in Remake, and it's not about being PC or overly sensitive, it just has so much more heart to it. It's still lighthearted and goofy, but the overall internal message of the Honeybee Inn section is actually really beautiful when you break it down. My mind is kind of blanking on the exact lines, but I remember Andrea telling Cloud essentially like, don't be afraid to be who you really are. And that's a really nice message to have out there. So with that being said, that is the video. Let me know in the comments down below, are you guys excited for Ever Crisis? And how curious are you to see how they structure Ever Crisis to work in tandem with things like Rebirth? And is there anything from Rebirth in particular that you're really excited to see moving forward? I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.